$9. Take all or none.
9.
Then they're yours.
They're not mine, but they're coming with me.
You ever get tired of fixing things?
Only when they stay fixed.
Then you'll fit here fine. You think it'll last?
Nothing does.
Then why build it?
Because some things deserve the try.
The afternoon sun pressed down on Dry Bluff, Arizona territory, October 1882. A light so dry it burned the color out of everything. The wind wasn't strong, but it carried dust fine as flour, and the air smelled of hot iron and tired horses. Judson Pryor rode in from the west, his shirt damp at the collar, his hat rim pale from sweat. He wasn't much to look at, tall, lean, with a beard gone uneven from neglect. His horse limped a little, and so did he. A widower doesn't move like other men. He saves his strength for things that might matter. He needed flour salt and a new pair of shoes for his daughter Sarah. That was all. He wasn't supposed to see anything or anyone beyond the walls of the general store. But trouble had a way of waiting for him like a debt still unpaid. He was tying his horse when he heard the voice, too loud, too cheerful. $9. Take all or none. The sound came from near the livery, the kind of shout that cracked across a street and left behind a silence full of curiosity. A few men had gathered there, ranch hands, drifters, a couple of town loafers looking for a story to tell. 3 women stood against the sun-bleached wall. Apache. They weren't chained, but a length of frayed rope still hung from the post beside them, like a memory someone hadn't decided to remove. The eldest stood tall, her face calm but hard as carved wood. Her dress was deer hide, worn thin at the hem, beadwork faded but clean. The second, younger by a few years, had long hair streaked with small white shells. Her eyes didn't look at anything in front of her. They seemed fixed somewhere behind the horizon. The youngest, barely more than 20, held her arms across her stomach and shifted her weight from one foot to another like a bird, unsure if the cage door was really open. The man selling them had a red kerchief, faded to rust, and a grin that didn't belong in daylight. Found him near the border, he told the crowd. No papers, no kin, no claim. Sheriff, don't want the trouble. $9 for the lot, won't split 'em. Someone spat. Someone else laughed. Nobody stepped forward. Judson didn't move, not at first. He'd seen his share of cruelty dressed up as business. He'd also seen what it did to men who looked away. The wind shifted and caught the eldest woman's braid, lifting it just enough to show the feather tied near the end. The small motion, that stubborn, defiant bit of color, was what did it. He reached into his coat. The folded bills there were meant for food, for shoes, for a winter not yet come. But when his thumb touched the corner of that worn paper, he thought of Sarah. Her thin hands, the quiet way she ate alone, and the sound of her whisper at night, "Mama," when she dreamed she wasn't motherless. He walked toward the livery. The crowd parted slightly, as men always do when they sense a decision larger than themselves. The seller squinted. "You buying?" Mr. Judson nodded once. "9," he said. The man's eyebrows rose. He hadn't expected anyone to call the price. "All right then. $9, they're yours." Judson counted the bills, carefully flattened them on his thigh, and handed them over. "They're not mine," he said, "but they're coming with me." The man laughed and shoved the money into his vest. "Call it what you want. Town won't ask questions." Judson turned to the women. His voice was low even. "Name's Judson Pryor. I've got a ranch northwest of here. 2 hours by wagon, maybe less. There's work, food, and quiet. You can come or not, but I'm leaving now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the eldest took a step forward, slow and deliberate. The others followed, not obedient, but in shared understanding. Judson walked them to the wagon, steadying the plank without touching a hand. They climbed up in silence. He took the reins, clicked his tongue, and the wheels began their creaking song. Dry Bluff fell behind its crooked roofs, its lazy smoke, its men who liked to watch misery and call it law. The trail stretched empty ahead. The horse trotted, slow hooves knocking dust from the hard road. Wind moved across the open land, brushing the tips of the mesquite like an invisible hand. For a long time there was no sound but the wheels and the breathing of strangers. Judson spoke first, not because he expected a reply, but because the silence pressed too close. "The house ain't much," he said. "Roof's patched. Wells a bit shallow. But it's quiet." No one answered. The youngest, the one with trembling hands, stared at the horizon. The middle woman glanced toward him once, then down at the boards of the wagon. The eldest sat steady, her expression unreadable. When the sun dipped lower, Judson pulled the wagon beside a shallow wash where a trickle of water glimmered between stones. He climbed down, filled the tin cup, and set it on a rock between them. "Water," he said simply. The eldest reached first. She took a small sip, then passed it to the next. The second drank, quietly wiped the rim, and handed it to the youngest. The cup went around once more before being set down again, half full. Judson didn't touch it. "You have names," he said, "but you don't owe them to me." The eldest looked at him, eyes steady. "Lydia?" The second said softly, "Asha." The youngest hesitated, then, "Nomi." Judson nodded. "My daughter Sarah." They said nothing, but he caught the smallest shift in the eldest's shoulders, as if that name, a child's name, had placed him somewhere different from the others who'd owned and sold. They rode on through dusk. The light turned copper, then violet, and the land began to cool. Coyotes called from the ridgelines, their voices rising and fading in the wind. By the time they reached the fence line of his ranch, the sky had gone dark blue, and the first star blinked above the hills. The place wasn't much to look at: a split-rail barn, a windmill turning slow, a cabin built by hands that had known grief, and lumber equally stubborn. He stopped the wagon near the porch and climbed down. "This is it," he said quietly. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and old air. A single table, 2 cots, a stove with one bent leg, and a scarf still hanging from a nail, his wife's. He'd never moved it. "You can sleep here," he said. "I'll stay in the barn." No one replied, but the youngest drifted toward the wall and sat cross-legged on the floor. The second touched the stove's edge, testing its coolness. The eldest crossed the room, looked at the scarf, and lifted it down. Without a word, she folded it once and laid it in the chest. Judson watched. The simple act felt like a benediction. "Thank you," he said. The eldest nodded slightly, then turned toward the others. A moment later, footsteps sounded outside, light ones dragging a blanket. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, hair tangled from sleep. She looked at the women, then up at him. "Papa, it's all right," he said softly. "Are they staying?" "I don't know." She thought for a moment, then whispered, "They look sad." "Maybe," he said, "or just tired." Sarah came closer, leaned against his arm, and watched them the way children watch animals they've never seen before. Curious, cautious, kind. The eldest, Lydia, met the child's gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away. Asha knelt by the stove and began arranging kindling with careful, practiced hand. Nomi pulled the blanket from her shoulders and laid it over the corner cot. Judson stepped outside to give them space. He sat on the porch, elbows on his knees, staring at the horizon fading into indigo. From inside came the faint clatter of wood, a breath of smoke, the shuffle of feet. He listened until he couldn't tell which sound was his own heart and which belonged to the house. The wind shifted colder. He reached into his pocket and felt the emptiness where his money had been, the $9 that had turned into 3 lives. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was mercy. He wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. Behind him, the door creaked open. Lydia stepped onto the porch. The moonlight traced the line of her jaw. "You don't lock your door," she said. Judson shook his head. "Never needed to." "Maybe you will now," she said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. "Maybe," he replied. She looked toward the hills where coyotes still called. "You got a girl," she said. "She needs warmth." He nodded. "That's what I'm hoping for." She gave a faint nod, neither approval nor dismissal, and went back inside. Judson stayed where he was, watching the sky grow darker, until the stars turned sharp. Inside, he heard Asha stirring something on the stove, the soft scrape of iron against wood. He heard Nomi humming low, a sound too gentle to be a song. And above it all, he heard a small laugh, Sarah's, thin and hesitant but real. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let that sound fill the emptiness the wind always tried to claim. $9, he thought. The price of a chance, and for the first time since his wife's death, Judson Pryor felt that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't come home alone. The morning came gray and still. Light crept slow across the frost, painting the yard in dull silver. Judson woke in the loft, the smell of hay and old wood thick around him. For a moment he didn't move. He just listened, the horse shifting, the soft click of the windmill, and something else. The sound of a pot being set gently on a stove. He pulled on his coat and went outside. The air stung his throat. From the barn, he could see smoke curling from the chimney, steady, thin, alive. It was strange how a thin line of smoke could make a man's chest loosen. He crossed the yard and pushed open the door. Inside, warmth moved slow and quiet. The three women were already awake. Lydia stood near the table, cup in both hands. Asha knelt by the stove, feeding the fire with calm skill. Nomi sat on the cot, folding her blanket into a square so perfect it looked measured. Sarah was wrapped in her old gray cover hair, tangled, watching everything without speaking. No one said good morning. The silence wasn't sharp like yesterday. It was the kind that lets you breathe. Judson set down the wood he'd brought in. "Pump's frozen," he said. "I'll see to it later." Asha nodded, once eyes on the fire. Lydia turned the cup in her hand, studying him. "You said we owe you nothing," she said quietly. "I did. Then we'll work. That's what owing nothing means." Judson didn't argue. "The barn rail's loose," he said. Lydia gave a short nod. "Where's your axe?" "Behind the door." She went for it without another word. He noticed the way her boots moved, careful but sure. Nomi's soft voice broke the stillness. "I can sew," she said. "Your mending pile, I saw it." Sarah turned in her chair. "My doll's dress is torn," she whispered. Nomi smiled faintly. "Then we start there." Asha stirred the pot, the faint smell of corn and beans filling the air. She didn't speak, but her hands moved with the rhythm of someone used to turning little into enough. They ate together not long, after slow, quiet bites of corn mush. Sarah watched Asha's hands the whole time, mimicking how she lifted her spoon. Lydia ate standing, as if her body didn't yet trust chairs. When the meal ended, Judson reached for his coat. The scarf that had hung by the door, his wife's, was gone. He looked around. Lydia caught his glance. "In the chest," she said simply. "Didn't feel right hanging?" He nodded. "Thank you." Outside, the air had softened. The sun was climbing pale through a strip of thin cloud. Judson fixed the rail, hammering the nails slow, steady. The sound echoed across the yard, not lonely anymore, just honest. When he turned, Lydia was there. She held the second hammer, the one with the cracked handle. "This post leans," she said. "Yeah." She lifted the hammer and worked beside him. No questions, no wasted talk. Sweat darkened the edge of her collar despite the chill. When she stepped back, the rail held straight. Inside, Asha was at the stove again. Nomi sat with Sarah, teaching her to stitch. The child's fingers fumbled, but she kept at it. "What's this word mean?" Sarah asked as Nomi hummed softly. "Home," Nomi said. Then she added, "In my tongue, gozu." Sarah tried it carefully. "Gozu," she whispered. Nomi smiled, the first full smile Judson had seen since the day before. By noon, light poured through the small window, touching the room with warmth that felt earned. Lydia came in from the yard, hair damp with sweat, carrying a bucket. "You don't lock your door," she said again. "Never needed to." "Sometimes you lock doors to remember what you've opened," she said, not unkindly. He didn't answer, just looked at Sarah, who was showing Nomi the doll, now mended. Her laugh came out small but clear. That sound, that tiny laugh, filled more space than all the words they hadn't said. They ate beans that night. Asha ladled them evenly. Lydia folded a strip of cloth into a pad so no one burned their hands. Sarah leaned against Nomi as she ate. Judson realized it was the first meal he'd shared with people since the funeral. When they finished, he went to fetch water. When he came back, the room looked different. Not in what it held, but how it held it. His tools were neatly stacked, the nails sorted into small tins. Asha had wiped the table smooth, and Lydia had hung his coat near the fire to dry the damp along the hem. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As night fell, the wind went quiet as if listening. Judson moved to bar the door. The wood slid into place with a clean thud. Lydia gave a small nod. "For the child," she said. "For the child," he repeated. He reached for his coat, ready to leave for the barn, but Asha stopped him. "Stay," she said. "The chair's near the fire." Judson hesitated. "It's your night," Lydia said. "Then we choose who keeps watch. Take the chair." He Saturday. The chair remembered him, groaned, once then settled. The firelight brushed over their faces. Asha by the stove, Nomi near the cots. Lydia at the door. Sarah curled under her blanket with the doll. The house made new sounds, not the hollow moan of empty boards, but the slow breathing of wood that knew company again. Outside, the windmill turned a lazy rhythm, 3 soft clicks before stilling. $9 had bought them nothing the world would call valuable. Yet here it was warmth, silence, the sound of people sleeping without fear. Judson leaned back, his hands loose on his knees. The fire glowed low, the kind that lasts till morning. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft hum from Nomi's cot, the sigh of Sarah in sleep, the steady heartbeat of a home learning to exist again. When he opened them, the last thing he saw was Lydia. Still by the door, her eyes half closed, her body finally at rest. The house breathed, and for the first time in a long time, Judson breathed with it. Winter came without warning. One morning the world simply woke stiff, the trough glazed thin with ice, the air sharp enough to draw tears. Frost painted lace along the barn door, and the mesquite turned pale as bone. Judson woke before dawn, as he always did. But now there were other sounds in the house, not ghosts, but motion. Lydia's boots crossing the floor, the scrape of Asha's ladle in the pot, the soft murmur of Nomi talking to Sarah, words too low to catch the kind that belonged to comfort more than conversation. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and smiled without knowing it. The air smelled of wood smoke and bread. Bread, real bread, something he hadn't tasted in almost a year. When he stepped into the kitchen, Asha was kneeling by the stove, her hands white with flour. She didn't turn, but her voice found him. "Fire needs a little more," she said. He added a log. The flame leapt and light touched her face. It was a quiet face, not beautiful like in a story, but full of a patience that could build walls out of air. Judson poured himself coffee, black and bitter, and watched her work. "Where'd you learn to bake like that, my mother?" Asha said. "Before the soldiers came." She said it plain, like she was talking about weather. Lydia came in from the cold breath clouding. "Snow on the ridge," she said. "By noon it'll reach us." Judson looked at her, the set of her shoulders, the line of her jaw. She'd taken to wearing his old coat, too big at the sleeves, too warm to argue over. It suited her somehow, like armor she didn't have to explain. Sarah stumbled from her cot blanket, dragging behind her. "It smells like something good," she said. Asha smiled, the soft kind of smile that doesn't need to reach the eyes to be kind. "Bread for strong hearts." Judson ruffled Sarah's hair, and the girl leaned into his side without thinking. It had been a long time since she'd done that. By midday, snow began to fall, slow, thick flakes melting as they touched the porch boards. The world went white in layers, as if the land had decided to forget itself for a while. Judson worked to bring the animals in, Lydia beside him, her hands bare despite the cold. She lifted a rail, tightened a hinge, her breath visible with every motion. "Shouldn't stay out this long," Judson said. "Work doesn't mind the cold," she answered. Then softer, "Nor does grief." He looked at her. The words hit deeper than she knew. "You talk like a preacher sometimes," he said, half smiling. She met his eyes. "You listen like one." They finished the work in silence. The snow thickened. When they finally stepped back onto the porch, both of them were shivering. Inside, warmth met them like forgiveness. Nomi had set blankets near the stove. Sarah sat close, drawing lines in the fog on the window pane. Asha handed each of them a cup of something hot water, thickened with a bit of syrup and spice. "Not coffee," she said, "but it remembers coffee." Judson laughed softly. "Then that's close enough." For a while no one spoke. The sound of the fire filled the room, a steady heartbeat. Sarah hummed a little off-key, and Nomi joined her without thinking. The melody was half lullaby, half prayer. When Sarah stopped, she looked up. "Can we build another house someday?" she asked. Judson blinked. Another house, one where they can sleep, she said, pointing at the three women. This one's too small. Lydia started to answer, but Judson lifted a hand. We might, he said, if the snow lets us. The idea hung there, fragile, impossible, but warm. Days passed short and bright. Work found its rhythm. Lydia helped Judson mend the fence and patch the roof. Asha took the kitchen as if she'd been born to it, turning scraps into meals that tasted like memory. Nomi mended everything she could find, curtains, saddle straps, even the hole in Judson's shirt he hadn't noticed. Sarah laughed more now, real laughter, quick and loud. Sometimes she ran to the barn to help, dragging Nomi behind her. The sound of her voice echoing against the boards made Judson stop and listen every time. One morning, while splitting wood, he found himself smiling at nothing. Lydia noticed. You're different, she said. Am I? Before you worked like a man counting hours? Now you work like the hours belong to you? He leaned on the axe. Maybe they do. Or maybe you just stopped being alone, she said. Judson wanted to reply, but the words caught. Lydia didn't wait for them. She walked back to the house, her shadow long and sure across the snow. That night the wind rose, fierce, shaking the shutters. The fire burned low. Judson checked the door, then turned toward the cots. Sarah was asleep between Nomi and Asha, her small hands curled in peace. Lydia sat by the table, carving a bit of wood into something that might become a spoon. Storms strong, Judson said. Strong storms leave clean mornings, she answered. He watched her fingers, steady, precise. You always this calm? No, she said. But fear wastes food and wood. They shared a faint smile. Outside, the snow fell harder. Hours later, a sound broke the night, a sharp cry. Nomi. Judson was on his feet in an instant. She sat upright on her cot, sweating, eyes wide. Asha knelt beside her, whispering in their language. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. Judson crouched near. She all right, fever, Asha said. It came fast. He touched Nomi's forehead, hot as coals. We'll need willow bark, maybe quinine. He reached for his coat. I'll ride. Lydia caught his arm. It's miles in the dark. I've ridden worse, he said. She's burning up. Lydia held his gaze a long moment, then nodded. Take the black horse. She knows the trail. Asha handed him a small pouch of dried herbs. In case you find nothing. Judson left before anyone could thank him. The snow bit at his face, the night black as ink. The horse pushed on hooves, muffled in the drifts. Every mile felt longer than it was. He rode toward the nearest settlement, where the doctor kept a small chest of medicine and fewer words. When he returned, dawn was breaking pale behind the ridge. His beard was crusted white, his hands stiff with cold, but he held the small vial like a treasure. Inside, the fire still burned. Lydia and Asha looked up as he entered. Medicine, he said simply. They worked in silence. Asha mixing the powder with water. Lydia holding Nomi still, Judson steadying the cup. The girl drank, trembling. An hour passed. Then 2. The fever broke just after noon, sweat glistening at her temples. Her breathing even. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Sarah sleeping on the floor beside her. Nomi's voice cracked. She stayed, Asha nodded. All night. Judson turned away, his throat tight. Lydia's voice followed him, low, certain. She'll live. He looked back at her. Because of you. Lydia shook her head. Because of all of us. That evening the storm ended. The snow outside shimmered under the moon, smooth and untouched. Inside, warmth filled every corner. Nomi slept with Sarah's hand in hers. Asha hummed by the fire, her tune soft as the wind beyond the walls. Judson sat by the window, staring at the white fields, at the faint steam curling from the roof. Lydia joined him, arms folded. You shouldn't have ridden, she said quietly. I had to. She nodded. I know. After a pause, you could have died. He smiled faintly. So could she. They sat together in silence, watching the light fade from blue to black. When Lydia finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. You didn't buy us, she said. You saved us. He shook his head. No, I bought a chance. You made it worth something. Her lips parted, as if to answer, then closed again. Instead, she reached out. and touched his hand, brief, uncertain, but real. The fire cracked. Sarah stirred in her sleep. Nomi breathed deep and easy. Judson looked around the small room, the patched curtains, the drying herbs, the boots by the door, and felt a strange weight lift. For the first time the cabin didn't feel borrowed. He whispered mostly to himself, "We'll build that second house come spring." Lydia smiled almost imperceptibly. "Then maybe this one can rest." Judson nodded, eyes on the quiet snow outside. The storm had passed. The world was small again, but alive every corner, breathing with the faint rhythm of people who had decided against all reason to stay. By the time the frost began to loosen its grip, the land had changed color. What had been white for months now showed thin ribs of brown earth, and the river, once a dull mirror, started to move again. The air still bit in the mornings, but the sun came earlier and stayed longer, like a friend testing if he was welcome back. Judson stood outside the cabin, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the snow melt in slow patches. The ranch looked small again, smaller than it had under the snow, but it felt alive. There were footprints everywhere now. Women's boots, a child's steps, not just his own. Behind him came the faint creak of the door. Lydia stepped out, tying her braid with a strip of cloth. "You're studying the ground like it's a map," she said. "Maybe it is," he answered, thinking where to start the new cabin. She followed his gaze toward the edge of the clearing, where the land leveled near a pair of junipers. "There's light there most of the day." He nodded. "Good spot. Close enough to share the well, far enough for space." Lydia crossed her arms. "You sure you want to build another?" "Sure as I've been about anything," he said. Her eyes softened. "Then we'll help." He looked at her, almost smiling. "You don't even know the plan." "We know the work," she said. "That's enough." The first day they cleared brush. Lydia swung the axe. Asha gathered fallen limbs into bundles. Nomi and Sarah carried them to the side of the barn. Judson marked the corners with stakes, measuring each step like a prayer. The sound of work filled the air, not rushed, not frantic, just steady. The rhythm of wood meeting earth, of breath meeting effort. At noon they sat in the grass with bread and beans from a tin pail. Sarah perched between Nomi and Asha, her face smudged but bright. "Is it going to be big?" she asked. "Big enough to hold warmth," Judson said. "Big enough for all of us," Lydia answered before he could. "For whoever needs it most." The girl nodded, satisfied, and leaned her head against Nomi's shoulder. Judson watched them, 4 figures framed by sunlight, their laughter carrying across the field, and felt a weight lift he hadn't noticed he still carried. The place that once echoed only with chores now sounded like life. By the end of the week, the ground was cleared, and the first logs were cut. Judson shaped the foundation by hand, driving the pegs deep. Lydia stood beside him, measuring each gap with her palm. "You build slow," she said. "Build fast, and it falls faster." She smirked. "That sounds like something your wife might have said." He stopped for a moment, the hammer resting on his knee. "She did," he said quietly. Lydia's expression softened. "She must have been a strong woman." "She was," he said. "Still is, I suppose, in the things she left me. And what's that?" He looked toward the cabin, where Sarah's laughter echoed faintly. "A reason to keep building." They went back to work. Each day followed the same rhythm. At dawn, Asha lit the stove. Nomi tended Sarah's lessons, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. Lydia split wood. Judson measured, cut, and stacked. They worked without talk most of the time, the way people do when speech would only break the spell. But sometimes small words slipped through. Asha brought him coffee one morning, the kind that tasted faintly of ash, but warmed the hands. "You'll need stronger beams if you mean to hold 2 winters," she said, setting the cup beside him. Judson smiled. "You've been watching." "Watching keeps a house standing," she said. That afternoon, Nomi appeared with rope and nails she'd scavenged from the barn. "You left these," she said softly. He took them from her, nodding his thanks. Her fingers brushed his just long enough for warmth to linger. By sunset, 3 beams stood upright, rough but steady. Sarah called them the bones. When Judson looked at them, he realized she wasn't wrong. Every house had a skeleton, but not all had a heart. This one did. It beat in the space between 5 people who hadn't known they'd needed each other. On the 7th day, the wind rose again. Cold returned for a visit, biting through coats and sleeves. Judson worked anyway. His breath hung like smoke. He swung the hammer until his arms shook. Lydia came to his side, her hair pulled tight against the wind. "You'll wear yourself out. I've been worse." She watched him for a moment, then took the hammer from his hand. "Rest," she said. "If this falls, I'll be the one under it too." He wanted to argue, but her tone left no space. She swung the hammer once, twice, steady and clean. He watched something between pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. When she paused, she said without looking at him, "You're not building this for us, are you?" He hesitated. "For all of us." "That's not the same." "No," he said. "It's better." Lydia turned her eyes, meeting his. The air between them was colder than the wind. Then she smiled barely. "You talk like a man who's learning to share." "Maybe I am." Spring thaw came sudden, as it always does. Water rushed through the gullies, carrying half the winter with it. The new cabin rose beam by beam. Its walls smelled of pine and fresh pitch, its floor rough but solid. Sarah helped pack mud between the logs, her small hands dirty to the elbows. Asha planted a small patch of greens near the porch. Nomi stitched curtains from old flour sacks, humming softly while she worked. Lydia sanded the doorframe smooth, her sleeves rolled high, her arms strong and brown from Sunday. Judson watched from the yard. For a long time he didn't move. The sight felt like something holy. When the roof was nearly done, Lydia climbed up beside him to steady the boards. The wind tugged at her braid. She looked at him across the slope. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nowhere left worth going. And if we left," he drove a nail, the sound sharp in the air. "Then it had stopped being home." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I guess we'll stay a while." By the time the cabin was finished, the fields had turned green again. Wildflowers dotted the fence line. The air smelled of rain and wood sap. They stood together in front of the new house, not fancy, not square, but strong. Smoke rose from the old cabin's chimney. Two homes now, side by side. Sarah grinned wide. "Which one's mine?" Judson laughed. "Whichever one you're in." Lydia looked at him, eyes unreadable. "And which one's yours?" He thought for a moment. "Both, I suppose." Asha set her hand on the doorframe, palm flat against the grain. "This one feels different." "Because it's yours, too," Judson said. Nomi stepped forward, tying a bit of ribbon red and frayed to the post. "So we don't forget what we built," she whispered. The ribbon fluttered in the soft wind. They went inside. The air smelled of fresh pine and bread. Sarah ran from one wall to the other, laughing, her voice echoing against new wood. Lydia opened the window shutters, letting light spill in. Asha knelt to light the stove. Nomi began to hum. Judson stood in the doorway, hat in hand. The sound of the women's voices mixed with Sarah's laughter, until it became something else. Not noise, not conversation. Life. He looked at what they'd made, the roof beams, the uneven corners, the smoke curling upward, and felt that rare, quiet thing that comes to a man who has done enough work to deserve rest. Outside, the windmill turned slow. The land, once empty, now carried the sound of hammers, laughter, and the creak of doors that would not close to anyone. The ranch wasn't big, it wasn't rich, but it was full, and as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Judson looked at the two cabins, one old, one new, and thought, "This is what mercy looks like, when it takes shape in wood and hands." He hung his hat on the post and went inside. The door closed gently, not with loneliness this time, but with belonging. The first snow of the new year came late, soft as breath. It fell without sound, covering the cabins, the barn, and the split-rail fences, until everything looked like it had been forgiven. Judson woke to quiet, not the hollow quiet of the past, but the full kind, the kind made by sleeping hearts and steady fires. He rose, slow, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The world was white again, but it didn't feel empty this time. Smoke rose from both chimneys, now twisting upward like two lines of the same prayer. He walked between the cabin's boots, crunching under the frost. From the new cabin came the sound of women's voices, soft laughter, the scrape of a chair, Asha's gentle hum. He paused by the door and listened. He'd grown to love that sound, though he didn't say it out loud. The door opened before he could knock. Lydia stood there, hair-braided, sleeves rolled. "You're early," she said. "Old habit," he answered. "Couldn't sleep." "Coffee's on," she said, and stepped aside. Inside, warmth bloomed. Asha was at the stove stirring a pot. Nomi sat on the floor with Sarah, showing her how to twist dried corn husks into dolls. The light from the fire brushed over their faces, making everything look softer, almost golden. Judson sat near the table, hands open on his knees. "Smells good." Asha looked up. "You always say that before you taste it." "Because it's always true," he said. Sarah giggled. "Papa says that about everything." He smiled, and for a moment the house felt too small to hold all that peace. Later, after breakfast, Lydia joined him outside. The snow had stopped. The air carried that clean, sharp stillness that comes only once a year when the land pauses to listen to itself. She watched him check the fence line, still fixing things that aren't broken, just making sure they stay that way, he said. "Seems that's what you do," she said. "Keep things standing." He leaned on the post. Not alone anymore. She studied him for a long time, her face unreadable but kind. "You ever think about what people in town would say if they knew about what us?" Judson shrugged. "They'd talk. Then they'd stop. That's what people do." "You don't care." He smiled faintly. "I used to. Now I care about who shares the table, not who talks about it." Lydia nodded, her breath curling in the cold air. "That's enough, I suppose." "Enough for me," he said. They stood there a while, listening to the windmill turn slow, each creak like a heartbeat. By noon, Sarah was outside, bundled in furs too large for her chasing flakes that melted on her mittens. Nomi watched from the porch, sewing quietly, her face peaceful. The fever months ago had left her thinner, but her eyes were alive again. Asha came to the door, a scarf wrapped over her hair. "She'll catch cold," she said. Nomi smiled. "Then she'll have someone to warm her." Asha laughed softly, and Judson felt the warmth of that sound travel straight through the cold air. He watched them, these women he'd once met, as strangers now moving through his world, like it had always been theirs, and wondered when exactly the ranch had stopped being his and started being theirs. He couldn't name the moment. Maybe it was when Lydia split wood beside him, or when Asha saved Nomi's life, or when Sarah first called Nomi sister. All he knew was that something had changed in the quiet, and none of them had tried to name it. That evening, as the wind picked up again, Lydia set the table. The smell of stew filled the air, onions, beans, and a bit of rabbit Judson had trapped earlier in the week. They ate together in easy silence, the fire popping softly behind them. Afterward, Sarah climbed into Nomi's lap and held up the corn husk doll she'd finished. "She needs a name," Sarah said. Nomi brushed the doll's hair of straw. "Then give her one." Sarah thought, hard brow furrowed. "Maybe Hope," she said. Asha looked up. "That's a good name." Judson nodded. "Fits this place." Lydia smiled, eyes warm in the lamplight. "Then Hope it is." They all sat there a moment longer, letting the name settle in the air like a blessing. That night, the snow deepened. The wind howled against the walls, but the cabins held firm. Judson moved between them, checking doors, making sure the fire in the new stove burned steady. When he came back inside, Asha was waiting near the table. "You walk too much," she said softly. "Hard to rest when the wind sounds like that." She stepped closer. "You listen for trouble because you remember it." Maybe. Her eyes were dark in the firelight. "There's no trouble here anymore, Judson." He searched her face, saw only truth there. "I know." Still, he stayed near the fire. She joined him, sitting quietly. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, she said, "When the thaw comes, what will you build next?" He smiled faintly. "Nothing, I think. Maybe just live in what's already standing." She nodded. "That's harder than it sounds." They sat until the fire burned low, until the silence between them became gentle. Before she left for the other cabin, she touched his sleeve, the same brief gesture she'd done months ago. A small reminder that choices can be soft and still matter. Days passed. The snow stayed, but lost its bite. Sarah's laughter filled the yard again, chasing the cold from corners the fire couldn't reach. Judson built a small bench between the two cabins, just wide enough for three. He didn't say why, but Lydia knew. One morning she sat there wrapped in her shawl, watching the land wake. Judson joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. Steam rose between them. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. "Every day, and I stop before I find the answer," he said. "It's enough knowing there's a tomorrow to think about." She smiled at that, a slow, quiet thing that reached her eyes.